Got it. All right. So last time we were doing some uh, examination of policies, particularly looking at these market-based mechanisms. Today we're going to look at um, a little bit more specifically at some of the California transportation policies. Um, and again, to highlight kind of the point of what we're getting at here is how sort of modeling has either helped inform the design of some of these policies or has helped to understand some of the impacts of the policies that have been implemented. I think a lot of the California policies are really good case studies of this type of thing because their regulatory agencies are sort of heavily steeped in a lot of sort of modeling analysis and coordination with researchers to make sure that the outcomes that is coming out of their regulatory policies are doing what they intend to do. So the first one that we'll start off with today, low carbon fuel standards. So this was actually first enacted 15 years ago, 16 years ago, by Governor Schwarzenegger. This is kind of following in the footsteps of AB 32, which is one of the big foundations for a lot of the regulation in California regarding climate change. So we probably haven't talked about AB 32, but for those who are less familiar, AB 32 set a series of carbon mitigation goals for the state of California out into the future. Notably, by 2050, they want 80% below what was being emitted in 1990. So that piece of legislation provides the impetus for a lot of other sort of climate policies to be passed, basically trying to meet those climate targets, right? And so LCFS is one of the big ones, one of the first big ones to try and meet those AB 32 goals. You may also have heard of something called the RFS, which is the Renewable Fuel Standard. That is a national level policy that in some respects is pretty similar to LCFS. But ultimately, there are sort of fairly important distinctions that lead to a lot of sort of downstream decisions about the regulation. So LCFS is specifically aimed at reducing emissions, whereas in RFS, the emissions is kind of like a secondary benefit. You could almost argue that it's more of a support for like for the corn lobby, right? RFS requires some percentage of ethanol be used in gasoline blends. Okay. So who manages the low carbon fuel standards? It is administered by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. The executive order passed by Schwarzenegger originally ordered CARB to coordinate with both the University of California, as in all of the universities of California holistically, the California Energy Commission, and other state agencies to propose a schedule to meet this 2020 target. So there was a big study done 2 decades ago, led by our fearless leader, Dan Sperling. For those of you who don't know who that is, he is a professor here at UC Davis. He heads the Institute of Transportation Studies and was also a recent board member of CARB. So led by Dan Sperling and Alex Farrell at UC Berkeley. So we'll dive specifically into this 2007 study for a little bit. So if we rewind the clock a bit, thinking about the sort of initial motivations, right? So LCFS is mainly designed to try and reduce emissions of fuels being used in the transportation sector. And the impetus behind that, even though emissions, relatively speaking, back then was higher for the electricity sector in the US, in California, because our power sector is relatively cleaner. The vast majority, or I wouldn't say vast majority, but most of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, was coming from the transportation sector. And as we've kind of discussed before, right, the transportation sector is notably more difficult to decarbonize than the electricity sector. So there was a lot of movement to try and have regulatory policies to help reduce this share of the pie. And right since then, even across the rest of the US, especially due to the transition from coal to natural gas, as we've talked about before, this portion of the pie has shrunk. So transportation is actually the largest contributing sector in the US too, at least nowadays. Okay. There are these sort of baselines in terms of this table itself is a little bit newer than was in the study. But this is essentially kind of our starting point, right? This is telling us how dirty some of the typical fossil fuels are that are being used in transportation. And the whole idea of LCFS is basically either to make these cleaner within each of these categories, which is one thing that has happened, but also, right, to switch from certain fuels to other potential fuels. Yeah.
Does diesel kind of encompass most of the medium and heavy-duty vehicle sector?
Yes. But I mean, there's a little bit of diesel you can use in light duty too, but yeah, generally speaking. Okay. So if we think about how you would go about actually doing this, right? Getting the fuels cleaner or getting people to switch the fuels, you could do it through a cap, which would act in a kind of similar way as cap and trade, as we talked about last time. But the decision in this particular framework was to focus on like a intensity target. So how much CO2 is getting released per unit of energy. So this is pretty similar to a fuel economy intensity target. It doesn't necessarily affect the activity reductions, which could be one of the byproducts if you had a cap as opposed to an intensity target, but rather it's reducing sort of pollution per unit energy. And importantly, thinking about this, so full well-to-wheels life cycle analysis rather than just the tailpipe. And so we're going to dive a lot more into that piece of it in just a second. But just, you know, for you guys to know, right, this is one of the first substantial pieces of regulation that takes into account like full-on LCA and analysis.
Define exact methodology of what's included in that wheel and
yeah, so we'll get into that. Yes. You want this standard to be relatively consistent so that that signal to the industry isn't all over the place. We tighten the targets over time. And one of the nice things about this type of framework, as opposed to other types of regulation that we'll talk about later on. This allows flexibility in terms of technology choice as long as you are reducing your intensity of grams of CO2 per megajoule. I don't care if you're doing it with gasoline or with electricity or hydrogen or whatever, right? And then we'll talk a little bit later about how the regulation is actually carried out and imposed. Yes.
Is engine efficiency any part of that?
So kind of. So they have these EER. What does EER stand for again? The yes, except so there's a little bit of nuance here in that so we have separate regulations for things like efficiency, but if you think about
like
exactly, yeah. So they have a, let me jump forward really quick. They have adjustments for the drivetrains. EER. I think it's like energy efficiency ratio, something like that, right? So then energy economy ratio. Thank you. So this is the adjustment that lets you sort of account for differences between drivetrains. Okay. So that is taken into account, and that's like kind of like an averaged out number. And they don't feel the need to get into specifics regarding the EER because you have like other regulations that are trying to do improvements in efficiency. Right. Yeah. But so for everyone, right? So this is kind of what lets you put everything on a like an apples to apples comparison by for the fuel itself. Okay, let me jump back really quick. So designing the standard, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could get to any particular target, right? And so there is essentially a percentage reduction that is mandated in the regulation. So by 2020, you have to get there, but there are lots of sort of different pathways you could do, right? And so this was one of the things that was being pointed out by the study, and depending on your choice of how to get to your target, that could have different implications on climate outcomes, right? And so technically speaking, which of these lines would reduce CO2 the most? Was that? Yeah, right. And so this is kind of a interesting perspective about climate goals that that you don't really think about unless you've taken some time to put in that sort of thought and analysis, right? So even at the same, even if you reach the same target, right? Because CO2 is this long-lasting greenhouse gas, what we really care about is the cumulative amount being put into the atmosphere. So the faster you decrease, leading to sort of less cumulative CO2 over time, then sort of the better your climate mitigation outcomes are. Yes.
The steep drops in rationale and accelerate in 2009 updated fuel economy standards.
No, so these were essentially these scenarios put out by the UC studies that were like kind of describing this effect and trying to come up with different sets of scenarios where they could try and describe like why these curves are kind of in this kind of trajectory. So, for example, like the tech forcing, they're saying you give like a buffer period to fuel producers to improve their technology, right? And that takes time. Yeah.
But the steep drop and then the kind of parabolic.
This thing? Like, oh, for accelerating?
Yeah. It just drops really quickly, and I presume that's like a cathode. Or like that's really
yeah, not entirely sure what the sort of motivation was behind that particular scenario.
I'll knock on dams.
Yeah.
Assuming there was some low-hanging fruit chains that can be made very quickly. I'm wondering.
Yeah, possibly.
CAFE standards change.
But so CAFE standards, right, wouldn't really be affected, wouldn't really affect LCFS compliance.
Okay.
Right, because
would it be the increase in ethanol production?
Possibly, yes. That could be, but not entirely sure. And this isn't like something that actually happened, right? This is just a hypothesis. So just to be clear though, right, because this isn't like a per mile thing, it doesn't actually care about like efficiency of the engine. It's the upstream fuel piece of it.
That big drop reminds me of is the big drops we saw in the electricity sector when carbon tax was applied. All those models is like immediate down and then sort of leveling off to various degrees.
Yeah. So this is kind of the initialization of LCFS. You can see the dotted black line, the big dot black line, it was the sort of proposed compliance curve. And this was the sort of initial, the small dotted black line is the initial compliance curve before some litigation happened. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And we'll also get a sense of kind of where we are today a little bit later. But this is kind of basically what the standard ended up looking like, and then projections about how we felt we would do. And so in the green is the sort of actual, and then the dotted green is the sort of expectation back in 2013-ish. At the sort of beginning, because the compliance curve was sort of flat for a couple years, you had a sort of buildup of banked credits. And then we will see what happens to that in a little bit. So covered this slide, or that latter half of the slide. But in terms of carbon intensity, right, so it's looking primarily at greenhouse gas emissions, and the global warming intensity is a way to translate all of the different GHGs into one sort of metric where it's basically describing your effect on climate change. So it allows you to standardize between like CO2 and methane and N2O. Yes.
So ER is a factor that you multiply or divide by calculate the use phase intensity for fuel combustion based on which would drivetrain fuel is going to. How is that featuring into that per megajoule number?
Yeah, so this adjustment allows you to take into account, because you are looking at the energy content of the fuel, it allows you to adjust them so that essentially these fuels are like giving you the same amount of activity at the end.
So
yes.
Which drivetrain the fuel is going into or plugged into?
Yeah, exactly.
That seems like a pretty large boon for plug-in hybrids, right? For electric drivetrain. Well, they don't. the owners of the vehicles don't.
Yeah. So LCFS is going to be, so we're going to see, so electricity is weird in LCFS. So we will talk about that, but you don't need to worry about like differences between the plug-in hybrids and gas, right? Because you know that electricity is going to be used in the motor. It's not going to get like mixed up into the engine somehow. So if you are, if the LCFS is being applied to like a utility, right, as opposed to the driver of the plug-in hybrid, then you don't need to worry about how much balance there is between gas and electricity. And if you're doing it for gasoline, if you're doing it for the producer or refiner, again, you know all of that is going into some engine somewhere. Yeah. Okay, so back to the 2007 study. As I had mentioned, there was this big thing about life cycle analysis, thinking about the upstream impacts of using any particular fuels. And so they actually used a couple different models, LCA models, in order to look at those emissions. And of course, there's going to be some discrepancies, right, between the numbers, right? You're naturally going to have variation between models, but here, right, you're talking about sort of a much larger difference in the emissions intensities of some of these fuels, and so why is this like a 7x difference here? So, actually, does anyone know the difference between GREET and LEM?
Maybe they're having different boundaries and methodologies.
Yes, essentially so. Do you know specifically?
Sometimes it's indirect land use impacts as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see in just a second. Those land use changes are different in terms of what those effects are, or in terms of what's included in the land use change and what was assumed to be included in the land use change. And that led to, these really big differences. Yeah.
Why is cellulose ethanol from California? Like that?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, there are instances of like biofuels, right, where you have where you get negative because like essentially you can think of like as a counterfactual, like if you didn't do this, it could release more emissions. So it could be, so possible reasons for that could be a byproduct, could be releasing some emissions naturally, right? Okay, and so as far as I know, this is one of the first instances where you do like a sort of proper incorporation of an LCA into like a real world policy. So this is analysis, the initial analysis conducted with GREET. So looking at LCA, basically, not only the emissions associated with the use of the fuel, but with how that fuel is initially sort of produced and manufactured, right? And so for biofuels, that includes, growing crops, harvesting, processing, and so on. And in that initial sort of study with GREET, there were a couple specific concerns, right? So one of the biggest one is land use change. And so the idea of land use change falls into sort of two categories where you have sort of direct and indirect. Okay. So essentially the counterfactual scenario, right, is that so if you had no policy at all, the way you can think of it, you've got these two regions, region 1, region 2. Both of these places are producing some crops for food production. So you can see like so. The what's known as direct land use change looks something like this. So essentially, you pass this policy which incentivizes people to harvest crops for bioenergy, right? And so if you think about it in LCFS, the idea is, okay, you've got this baseline emissions intensity, it's got to lower, right? And so if your baseline is like gasoline, you're saying, okay, let's lower that by including some less carbon intensive fuels such as ethanol. Okay, and so that creates this economic incentive, right, through LCFS to do this. And so now you've got people producing bioenergy crops. There's an alternative here known as indirect land use change, which is it may actually be cheaper for existing food production to just divert what they're producing to bioenergy as opposed to like trying to open up sort of new land, right? And so you might expect something like this to happen instead. And so you have now reduced your domestic food production, which might look something like this, right? We've converted these 3 units of corn into biofuel energy. And instead, let's say in Brazil, I've now decided to, supplement that food demand by cutting down rainforests, right, in like the Amazon, and deciding to grow crops to supplement that food demand that was lost here. Okay. And so you can imagine that the land use impact of doing something like this versus doing something like this could be really different depending on where you think that crop is going to be grown. Yeah.
Assuming that in order to produce the soybean production, like in this case, is outside of California, right?
Sure.
And with understanding that California does also like exert its policy influence more broadly in terms of like fuel economy, like how is there outside of border policies, like how do other states like interact or think that's like another state like California, you have this policy, it's impacting my growers, this is, I don't like it, it's illegal, you don't have jurisdiction over like the cropland, right? You have jurisdiction over fuel that's consumed, but not if it doesn't happen in your state, you don't have jurisdiction.
Yeah. So the important caveat here is to understand it for LCFS. It's not like I'm enforcing any regulations here in any way.
Not directly, but waterfall.
Yeah.
But it's like a waterfall effect of the policy itself. Like, yeah, the market eventually pushes it out, but
isn't it the California climate jurisdiction as it is the market that's
okay. So hold that thought for a second and let's think about something else. So like let's say California decides to pass its own fuel economy standards, which it does. So California, and we'll say some of the other states that it affects, we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. So they account for, let's say, about 30% of the vehicle market. And so automakers in Michigan have to, right, deal with the fact that California has their own policies.
Yeah, no, I understand. I guess because there's like
so
farming is just more of a sensitive topic in places than like production of
yeah.
vehicles
So,
and stuff.
so LCF, the effects of LCFS are less direct than this fuel economy example, right? Because it's not about this regulation sort of directly affecting these guys in any way. It's simply affecting the number that we decide to use for the emissions intensity for biofuels. And then there are these sort of trickle down effects through the market, right? Okay. Any other questions about this? Yeah.
Are those indirect land use change effects quantifier computers and price elasticity thing that how much quantity demand of biofuel feedstock like corn would increase if the price of the biofuel goes up or if demand goes up? How do you predict this counterfactual if you want to know the indirect land use change?
Yep. And that was the really hot topic back then, was like, oh, how do you actually know that this is what's going to happen, right? Well, it's not an answerable question, really, unless you actually just do it, right? I mean, you can think about academically how to answer it, but
to answer in the sense of the other models, the discrepancies, how did they?
Yeah. So in terms of modeling, it's not so difficult, right? You could just build a supply and demand curve for whatever food product that is, right? And it would be an international like supply curve. So that's how you would initially come to the conclusion that you think this will be happening and not this, because this is way cheaper to do than this, right?
It's going to come down a bit to how cheap Region 2 considers, clear cutting forests to be socially, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the big thought here is that we would basically expect deforestation to be happening in like the Amazon. Yeah.
You able to justly said marginal justly production. So when you're doing the LCA for standard for fuel, are you looking at the average effects or marginal?
This is the average, but I don't think the wording is really good here. It's basically like California specific gasoline is what this is referring to. Yeah, and actually because of LCFS and some other regulations, gasoline in California is different from gasoline in other states. So this number would actually be different in California versus other states. Yes.
So measure in or even satellites framework.
Yeah, I mean, it's not super precise, but like probably the magnitude of the emissions here are fairly accurate. And so there have been databases that have been developed to look at emissions associated with production of materials and growing of crops and that sort of thing in different regions. And so these types of analyses typically will draw on those databases to understand what the like region-specific implications of doing something like this would be. Yeah. So if you take an LCA class, you learn more specifically about those databases, what goes into them, and how you would do specifically calculations like these. Yes, right. Who's taking Alyssa's class? Yeah, so you guys hopefully get that. Yeah, and we're gonna have another quiz right now. Yeah, so this is the unintended consequences of diverting food to fuel production. Yeah, which is back then a really fairly sort of novel concept, and uses a lot of sort of global agriculture and land use models to accurately get at the effects of doing that sort of diversion. Yeah, and so if you think about it, this is a sort of great example of injecting, scientific modeling into the regulatory process, right? So in the sort of open comment submission period, you had a bunch of folks that were responding directly to that 2007 study about whether or not we should include indirect land use change. So there were some folks who were basically saying there's not enough data to create sound policy, which is a totally fair critique, right? If you think about what I was just saying, you're hypothesizing this counterfactual scenario based off of this analysis, and who's to say that you could accurately depict the sort of market outcomes of doing something like this. You have this group called the New Fuels Alliance, representing biofuel companies, researchers, and investors, questioning the validity of indirect land use change. Surprise, surprise, they have a lot riding on this, right? Because LCFS represents a potentially large revenue opportunity for these companies. So, for them, it's in the best interest to not have indirect land use change included. Yeah.
Is there a time horizon element to the indirect land use aspect? Because if you have a policy intervention in fields that changes the demand for corn and corn ethanol, so I'm guessing the land use changes happening, indirect land use happens over time. Will the multiplier that penalizes higher fuels also change over time? Does that change over time, or is it one constant value that applies?
No, I mean the modeling is sophisticated, so they try and do this over a period of time to look at some of those dynamics. But again, that uncertainty sort of propagates over time as well, so it gets even harder to say about the future. Yeah.
When this study came out, how did that impact us? What did
not much. Yeah, not much. RFS doesn't do any it doesn't really care about upstream stuff.
Were there any questions about it when this came out? It said, "Oh, well, now we're requiring 20%."
Well, holistically, sort of there are interactions between LCFS and RFS, and there were sort of, I'm sure, some kind of coordination at that point, but nothing that would really affect the RFS regulation.
No one really cared, basically, that, hey, we said that we're going to require a minimum blend, and now we realize, oh,
yeah,
it's actually worse than what we thought it was.
Yeah.
But leave it.
Yeah. Again, RFS is not a emissions-based policy, right?
Correct.
So, did you have a question? Yeah, so that's more related to this RFS question. So RFS is the national requirement to essentially include ethanol into gasoline blends. And so that in itself creates some incentives, right? There's a sort of market for that. For LCFS, some particular types of biofuels are going to be subsidized in the sense that you can get credits for them. But for some of the typical sorts of biofuels like corn ethanol, because of the inclusion of indirect land use change, they didn't get anything. Yeah. Yeah, and so this last group, which is sort of the largest set of commenters, you had 170 or so scientists and economists basically saying, yes, indirect land use change has high uncertainty, but it's better than just saying that it's not there at all. And so at the end of the day, CARB announced that they would be including indirect land use change into LCFS, which basically precluded huge swaths of the biofuel industry from being able to take advantage of this standard. Yes.
Is there any consideration for the trade-off from the biodiversity, the land, like factoring in everything?
Yeah, that's all included in the analysis of the land use change, right? So there, I mean, obviously you're going to have some how should I say, some variation in how people feel you should be valuing things like biodiversity. But it's for sure would be included in the analysis that's trying to do that valuation. Right. Yeah, and so lots of uncertainty for biofuels. Um, as was just mentioned, the like both spatial but also temporal variability, data limitations in terms of sort of understanding, things like feedstock yield, fertilization, and then scientific uncertainty with the land use parameters themselves. So shortly after this was happening and LCFS was just integrated, you had lots of people doing studies and analysis of like as like a post hoc investigation of the regulation. So kind of at the other end, things like looking at uncertainty. And so this is kind of a nice example focused around a Monte Carlo sort of simulation in order to understand sort of the distribution of possible emissions levels for different types of biofuels. And so you can see if you didn't include land use change, what it would look like, versus if you did include land use change, what that would look like.
There's a curve at the top, yes.
Yeah, that goes. Here, hang on. I got you. There you go. It looks like that.
He's gonna sleep tonight so well.
God.
Yeah. Yeah, not much variation for gasoline, especially relative to your other sort of fuel types.
That gasoline includes the hot gasoline.
Yes, it
That's
does. Yes. Okay. So that 2007 report ultimately ends up making these like 22 recommendations, including, right, the inclusion of some of the upstream emissions in LCA, including land use change, and a bunch of other stuff, including hilariously more research, because universities always say we need to do more research. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 2009 ruling So CARB incorporated most of the recommendations from the UC studies. They conducted a bunch of public workshops. A lot of the studies end up getting peer reviewed, and they had a public hearing where anyone could essentially submit comments. And so all of these things get wrapped up in the policymaking process that ultimately lead to the formation of the regulation that responds to all of these external set of input into the design and formation of the policy. Yes.
What are the rules about incorporating the feedback like this into the regulation?
Yeah. So let me go through the sort of process that that goes through how a regulation is formed. So essentially what happens, and this is essentially the same both in California at the state level and at the national level. So a regulatory agency essentially publishes an initial rule that says, okay, here's the regulation that we want to create. And then once that initial rule goes out, there is a period of time where you are open to comments. So that's a open comment period. Usually that's going to be at least 1 month, can be as long as 6 months. Again, depending on the regulatory agency, size of the regulation, and so on. After that, regulatory agencies are actually required to respond to every single comment provided by the public, or formally submitted into that commenting platform. Usually you can submit them online. And so those comments can vary anywhere from, great, I received your comments and we acknowledge your comments, right? But usually it's going to be a sort of direct response and an indication of whether or not they decide to change the regulation in response to a particular comment. Yeah.
A little off topic, but I'm wondering if you have any insight on how CARB is so resilient against capture by the industry. I mean, they're going up against the coin industry and the fossil fuel industry and car manufacturers. A lot of these cases just keep making the right calls that seem to be untainted by these industries. That's
well. Yes. You could make that argument for any regulatory agency, right? So there are stakeholders that have a vested interest in any piece of regulation that's being made. And to the extent that, let's say, they're sort of corrupted, I guess, or influenced by like stakeholders who are involved in this process. Yeah, I mean, that's like you're asking like why that hasn't really happened. I wouldn't.
They're still able to make these sort of
yeah,
sweeping and powerful.
It's part of like how the charter that CARB has as a regulatory agency.
Yeah.
It's very, very powerful. And like he's appointed before that make all the things go in some ways like pretty more different.
So yeah. So there is different levels of insulation against things like that, right? So the design of a regulation itself can push back against the ability of stakeholders to influence it in certain ways. The fact that the like the staff of ARB, these are not so you have like career staff, right? So these are not like political appointees, and that can have a important role in the way that comments are sort of responded to. There's like the staff themselves are not invested in this in alignment, right, with stakeholders. I mean, there is opportunity for that in terms of in CARB in particular, their regulations have to get approved by a board. That board are full of political appointees, right? So those, the board of CARB is appointed by the governor. But historically in CARB, those board members have been, you know, sort of fairly environmentally minded people. Like Dan Sperling was on the board. Yeah, and then the other thing that I wanted to say is that for sure there are suggestions from stakeholders that are like trying to nudge policies in ways that would benefit them. But at the same time, there are also very useful comments coming from stakeholders. So it's not all just like totally crazy, unreasonable things to try and benefit themselves. They often have very legitimate concerns that may or may not have been overlooked, right? And so, yeah, this process is a nice way of being able to hear those concerns. You just have to be careful in filtering out things that are legitimate versus, let's say, explicitly benefiting some stakeholder. Okay, so that rulemaking was finalized in April of 2009 by CARB and set to start on the first day of 2011. In December of 2009, the Renewable Fuels Association and Growth Energy, which are lobbying groups by US Ethanol, filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of LCFS. And there was an injunction against its implementation in December 2011. So basically, they halted the regulation. And that was removed by the Ninth Circuit shortly thereafter. And so, yeah, the LCFS has actually been challenged a number of times. This is an old slide. This would have been the last month last year. Yeah, so actually, it has successfully navigated several lawsuits against the regulation. And so where are we today? So I had shown in an earlier slide what it was like sort of right at the beginning. And this is essentially where we are today. Those are the compliance targets in black, and green is what actually happened. Notice that if the green line is over the black line, you're technically out of compliance, but they stored enough credits back here that they could use some of the bank credits to deal with that. Yeah.
Was the excess credits, in fact, they got stored, indication that initially the standard was set to lose, and maybe the benchmark was too sort of high, and a lot of people take advantage by doing the low hanging fruits and banking those credits.
Yeah, so part of it was the litigation, but then also, you know, it just means the regulation it is a little bit more conservative upfront to give companies an opportunity to comply. And so there's uncertainty, right, about how well we would be able to comply, but it seems like it wasn't that big of an issue. Okay, so how do you meet LCFS? Right, so we've been sort of hinting at this, blending low carbon biofuels, which was one of the big debates, right? With all this land use change stuff. But also there are other low GHG fuels, right? So natural gas, hydrogen, electricity. So you can buy credits from other suppliers. And then you could also sort of improve efficiency of refinery operations. And that's one way that you could reduce the emissions intensity of, your current day fuels like gasoline. Yeah.
Are those credits tradable as allowances?
Yeah. So in a similar way with the allowances in cap and trade, right, the credits that you generate from LCFS can be traded. Yeah. But it's yeah, but it's essentially on like this open market, right? Where you think about I get these credits from compliance with LCFS, and then people who would need the credits could purchase them on the market. And we'll look at some of those dynamics in just a second. Okay. So what the heck are we looking at here? So these are the efficiency adjusted carbon intensities. So here's carb OB, that is your baseline for gasoline. But you'll notice that there are, for a lot of these fuels, you have all of these sort of different dots all over the place indicating that actually you could have different sort of carbon intensities if you were producing, let's say, renewable diesel, and these carbon intensities are representing essentially different processes for production of the fuel. So the way that this works, that CARB set forth, is for all of these different fuels, there is a baseline number, right? And so that baseline number is typically a fairly pessimistic number for carbon intensity related to that fuel production. And if you are making, let's say, renewable diesel, instead of saying taking that baseline number here and saying that this is your carbon intensity, instead you could actually say, I produce renewable diesel in a cleaner way than you think that I do, right? That's what they will tell CARB. And in fact, I can produce it instead of up here at like 90 grams of CO2, I could do it here at like 50 grams of CO2. And so they submit documentation on their process, and they are then allowed to claim a lower carbon intensity. And so this is a nice kind of incentive that allows other fuel producers to figure out low carbon intensity ways of producing the fuel and showing that to CARB and claiming sort of a lower carbon intensity to get more LCFS credits. Yeah.
So is there just one CO2 intensity benchmark that applies to all fuels or individual fuel category benchmarks?
No, it's one benchmark number that was a baseline off of your gasoline, and then that number in aggregate sort of decreases over time.
So, but I see the same part of the also where there's present for every fuel. So is that
It's not, no. Like right here, like electricity is over here.
Yeah, it's over there. No. See, probably that's baseline. But then the one on the little triangle on the furthest, square on the furthest right, that's just the highest intensity
for that fuel.
For that fuel. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so you have a bunch of them even going into the negatives, right? Where they're able to demonstrate that usually this is going to be for biofuels. Um, yeah, determining that, you know, in your counterfactual, you would actually have more emissions. So the folks that participate in LCFS, so these are your regulated parties. So anytime a transportation fuel is imported or refined or sold, these regulated parties have to enter information into the LRT, which is the LCFS reporting tool. And then you have credits, awards, and deficits tracked for every regulated party. Okay, and so as it pertains to trading, so these are the credits and deficits by fuel and quarter. And so you can see kind of what that looks like here. And so all of these, all alternative fuels are generating LCFS credits, and all of these fossil fuels, so gasoline and diesel, are generating a deficit, and so the credits have to match up, right? And so these deficits are going to be growing over time because the LCFS regulation, right, is saying that the intensity has to decrease, which means that if you continue using fossil fuels, you're going to be generating more and more deficits of credits. And so this can be decreased by either cleaning up your diesel and gasoline production or using less of it. Or you can continue to have these deficits grow, but then you have to produce more alternative fuels. And you're always making sure to sort of balance against that sort of decreasing standard target. We can see that, all right, where's my electricity? Yeah, here we go. So electricity on road. So that is these guys over here, and that piece will be growing. But a lot of this right now is for ethanol blended in gasoline. And so these are sort of biofuels. This is an older picture. So this is 2015, 2016 at the end. And you can imagine that since then, right, your electricity portion has continued to grow. What do credit prices look like? Something like this. So you can see sort of the trend. We would expect LCFS credit prices to continue to sort of increase generally over time as your standard increases in stringency. Yeah.
At what point are those credits generated and required? So is that when the fuel is delivered to tank or when it's pumped up? At what is the timeline?
Well, wait, what do you mean by timeline?
If a credit is issued, does
Yes.
it have to be essentially if it's issued for 1 megajoule of fuel that is sold in the state? Is it issued when the fuel supplier delivers the fuel to a pumping station or maybe a refueling station, or when it increases? At what point are those credits allotted?
Once you enter the information into the LRT, you automatically get some position on how much award or deficits you have in terms of credits.
But is it verified that the seller actually sold that fuel in the state? How does the system verify that?
Oh. At one of these 3 points.
So is it like you have to,
depending on the fuel, it can't get double counted, but
I gotta do an example for like every.
Well, electricity is going to be
Okay,
different.
well, for a gas line, you register the gasoline pump with CARB that has an ID. Right? And then the ID is there, CARB knows what it is. So that's, and then you submit it every quarter, you get your credits, and you can keep them or sell them. You have brokers that sell them. Once you sell them, you like retire those credits on your books. Go ahead and take all this.
Yeah. It wouldn't be at the pump though, but it would, but yes, essentially. Right.
Well, I think the pumps that you can verify how much went through like a standard gas line. I think it's a pump.
Okay. I thought it was upstream of that, but I might be wrong. I thought it was a.
But I think it's that they have to track.
So I'll double check this. My impression is that it was at the sort of bulk storage terminals, but I might be wrong. Okay, but I do want to talk about electricity, which is weird in LCFS if you think about it. Oh, yes.
In station technology.
Yeah.
We went through CFS
Uh-huh.
and we were able to comment after analyzing the workshops on the models and the scenarios.
Okay.
And it was like really interesting, and we actually published our comments. I don't know.
Did everybody do that? How so? And when was this?
December.
In December.
No. There.
Wait, what were you commenting on?
The workshop, there was a workshop discussing the new CFS.
Okay.
Scenarios, but they were like super high in biofuels, and some of us argued like the risks of it to do with like pushing biofuels.
Yes. So that debate is still happening. So that debate is still happening about land use change.
I mentioned it because it's open. If you go to the product page, you can actually post your comments.
Yes, you can look at other people's comments. Yeah. Which is actually another screen against the
So like it actually works. I mean, I don't know how much they're probably under right?
Yeah.
It is really
well, so hang on. So I know so LCFS went through 2020 and it was recently extended, I think in 2017, 2018 to 2030. So you're talking about commenting on, so are they just kind of getting information about LCFS? Because this isn't for another rulemaking process, right?
It's concepts of California resources, sports, low carbon fuel standard, public workshop, concepts and tools to science target.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
They could either be really stringent or really, or keep the same with the time model.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, very cool. So
like comments on the last modeling efforts.
Yeah, which is important. I think so one of the nice things right, in regards to regulation that comes out, there's this process of like, oh, how do you tell that the regulation is doing its job? How do you tell that the regulation is good? And so interim analysis and modeling, even between like rulemaking periods, which is essentially, I think, what you're talking about with these workshops is really important. Okay, so let's get wacky with LCFS. So if you think about if we just think about the primary purpose of LCFS, what it was built to do, what it was built to handle. So we promote the production and use of alt fuels, and you promote the reduction in the carbon intensity of fuels. So how does that relate to electricity? So unlike every other alternative fuel that was in that list, right? It's not a supply side issue. It's not like, oh, we're not being able to produce enough of it, right? This is demand from vehicles. So from that respect, it's already like inherently very different from all the other types of fuels. And there's this question of whether or not LCFS is meant to induce things like the growth of a technology versus its kind of use as a fuel. And then importantly, does LCFS, so if we think about all of these other fuel types besides electricity, right? LCFS, you inherently have some ability to try and produce fuels in a way that reduces carbon intensity. You're like incentivized to do that, okay? And so the question is, does that same mechanism kind of exist to reduce carbon intensity for electricity, right? So in other words, would you get more LCFS credits if you were producing electricity from a natural gas plant versus if you were producing electricity from a solar panel, right? And the answer is no, you don't. So different again. And then as far as who LCFS would be regulating, who would be that regulated party that I was talking about for LCFS. For other fuels, it's a little more straightforward, right? You're either producing it, refining it, right, or importing it. For the regulated parties for electricity, you know, it could be providers at public charging stations, could be the site hosts of the charging stations, could be fleet operators, transit agencies. Some discussion, there was some discussion about station owners for like battery swapping, and then obviously utilities. Yeah.
Promoting reduction. If you rate, so you have your tariff, 100% renewable, like some CCS offer. If you can show that the charging happens on that rate, you actually can get more credits than the standard, the baseline regulations.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult.
Yes. Okay. So there are mechanisms. So maybe it is a little bit more analogous, but yeah.
Track it.
Yeah.
Tied to the bin number.
Yeah. Yeah. Physically speaking, it's so you're talking about a like a market-based mechanism to demonstrate lower carbon intensity of electricity production. But it wouldn't be like a physical, yeah, because you cannot control the flow of electrons.
We have purchased this.
Yeah.
Here's the aggregate.
Yeah, so it's doing what the other fuels are doing in a indirect way.
Now I don't know how changes actually can
yeah. Yeah, possibly. So most of the LCFS credits. So what do you guys think? Who do you think is getting most of your LCFS credits? Not you. I know you know. Anyone? Any guesses out of this list? Yes, utilities. So credits go to the utilities. And the way this happens is ARB has this sort of estimate where you're basically, unlike all of these other alternative fuels, right? Renewable diesel and all these other, biofuels, whatever, where we know all of that is going into some kind of transportation mode at the end of the day. Like electricity is supplying other types of demand as well. So it's tricky. So you have to get a good accuracy, or you would like to get a good accuracy of that electricity going into specific vehicles, right? So you can see how many EVs there are in your utility territory. You can estimate how much they actually use, multiply in a day, multiply by the number of days in a compliance period. Yeah.
Is hard justification for giving them alerts, and especially if other electricity service providers who are actually generating that clean electricity are the ones.
You look like you want to say something.
There's base credits and there's incremental credits. So utilities get base credits, so you use like PG&E, and then other electricity providers like Valley Clean Energy and Davis would get the incremental credits. If you can tie it, there's a whole other way in which you have to do it. Utilities just get it. They just get it, but anyone else.
That's how it is.
It's because in their service territory, no matter what electricity, like every car, right? If it's charged at a meter at home, that's their end, right? Like it's the byproduct of I have a monopoly.
It's similar, it's analogous to the question that we were talking about with gasoline, like should the gas station get it, or should the, or someone upstream of it get it, right?
Upstream you have individual like power plant operators, right, which are, it's hard to increase the energy efficiency of a power plant.
Yeah. But what is a utility going to do? Well, so, but also administratively, utilities are probably the easiest one to do this as well, right? How do we know how much electricity gets used by an average electric vehicle in a day? How do you know how much what this number would be, the average electricity used by an electric car in a given day? So the way that utilities do this is there are vehicles that are separately metered, okay? And to give you a sense of kind of what that looks like. So back in 2017, the way they were doing this is, right, so electricity is powering our lights and our computers and our projectors and cars, and it's all going into a single meter, so I don't know how much is going to the car and how much is going to the lights and all these other things, unless you have a separate meter for the car. And so they rely on cars that have separate meters to be a representation of all the rest of the cars. So to give you a sense of how many that is, in PG&E, that's like 500 cars representing 127,800 cars in LA, representing another 120,000. How representative do you guys think someone who owns a separate meter for their car would be for all of these other? Yeah. It's probably not great. Yeah. Yeah. People have their own meters. Yeah, because you're like a giant data nerd or something.
There can be, you have your own meter too, on the building, right? And you have the chargers.
Yeah.
And you separately do it if you want it to be on the day, or you want to allocate the cost accurately. So.
Yeah.
Choose one now for PG&E, where you choose if you're a tier one or if you would like.
Yeah.
Like as one is for electric users. Basically, if you have an electric car, choose this.
Yeah. So that helps them get an understanding of this number, right? But it actually doesn't help with this thing, because you could be on an EV rate because they know you have a registered EV.
You don't know where the load.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's if you have a car or your house, it's like an electric car, so you could not even have that.
No. There's an EV specific rate in PG&E and in these other territories. Yeah. So if you own an electric vehicle, you have to provide proof of registration, and then you can qualify for that rate.
But there's two. Is there pump or EV?
I don't think there's one for heat pumps. But okay, yeah. Yeah, so this actually pertains to what you were saying earlier. So the allocation of those credits to utilities, it's they use a flat carbon intensity value. This is the unadjusted EER one, so it's like 3x lower, right? But we also know that emissions from your grid is not flat. And also, right, so if you were to charge at different times, your emissions intensity could be, 3.5 times higher, right? So 80 grams of CO2 per megajoule versus 20, right, during the day. And so, you can't, by default, this is not sort of accounted for.
Just to be clear, yeah, it's home charging EV, and it says either this is for EV, battery storage, or electric.
Okay.
Do you have any of the three? So that's just 20 more.
What's it called? And is this
electric home E-dash?
E dash? Okay, so this is not the EV dash.
No, there's not two.
Yeah.
This is a totally separate thing.
Okay, and this is PG&E.
This is PG. There's a
Okay.
$15 per month base service charge.
Then it's like use 800% more. It's your baseline.
Yeah. Well, so again, so either way, like that doesn't really have anything to do with the like separate meter part of it. It will give you some idea of like a particular type of house, but yeah. So probably not great representation of your population.
Is there any sort of adjustment applied to that? I know when you're doing political polling, you're getting the people to answer the phone more weirdos. Do they do some sort of adjustment here, or just take that data at face value?
No, that's it.
Are you asking if utilities are caring for?
Yeah, and so utilities receive this money. Okay, so let's think about if you are not electricity, but you are an alt fuel provider. You are an alt fuel provider of some other type of fuel, right? You are incentivized to reduce your carbon intensity to receive more LCFS credits, right? But for utility, they receive the credits just based off of the number of EVs in their service territory, right? So they don't really have an incentive to like make the electricity cleaner necessarily. Yeah.
The fact that my parents are on something like this, you get a lower rate at night, right?
Yeah.
When you're going to have a higher intensity on it.
Yeah. Yes. Unfortunately. So it may even be worse. So the PUC and CARB basically wanted to try and make it so that LCFS would be providing some kind of correcting signals, right? So you want to benefit current or future EV customers and educate the public on benefits of EV transportation. So provide rate options that encourage off-peak charging and minimize adverse impacts to the electricity grid. So PUC basically requires that the credit revenues from LCFS, that a portion of them go into reducing the cost of electric vehicles, apply an annual credit against customers' bills, but not to pay for charging infrastructure or lower volumetric rates for EV drivers. Yeah, so this has changed since the original mandate by the PUC. And so it actually does support some things like you can actually use the money for like residential chargers. Okay. So backing out all of this, LCFS is this relatively successful example where you have sort of scientific input to back how a policy is formed and sort of updated. LCFS has been estimated to reduce over 20 million metric tons of CO2 since its implementation, and increased productivity of hundreds of millions of dollars. All right, let's see. I'm thinking about if I have enough time to go through all of ZEV. Yes. Let's see.
Peter, what's your background in before you came here? Is it zero emission vehicles?
So I think it's something around that. I don't know if the exact words.
Something like that. Okay, we'll do a little bit of this, but we may pick up next week. So the other piece of the transportation sector that has had sort of a really substantial impact, zero emissions vehicle rule. Okay, so LCFS, making fuels cleaner, ZEV regulation, it's basically a requirement to automakers to basically produce zero emission vehicles. California is the US's largest market for cars. So there's about 25 million registered vehicles, right? And all of these impacts are contributing to climate change. And so in order to meet our AB 32 goals, right, that I was mentioning before, 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below those levels by 2050. Another piece of that transportation puzzle is California basically shoving everyone to electric vehicles. This is fundamentally different from the other policies that we've talked about so far, right? So carbon taxes, cap and trade, and even LCFS to some extent are sort of market-based mechanisms that allow flexibility in terms of compliance. So how you get to a particular target is sort of determined both by the target, but also by like economic viability and the competitiveness of different types of technologies and fuels to meet that target. ZEV basically says, nope, like you have to do it this way, right? And so this would be more of a man, I forget what Dan wants me to call it. He hates it when I say command and control. But it is a command. Yeah. Sure. So command and control is basically like the government tells you what has to happen. So it's more in that spectrum of things than a market-based mechanism. Okay, how does the regulation work? You've got ZEV credit requirements based on how many cars that you sell. It's pretty straightforward. So let's say I sell 100,000 cars a year in California. That if the credit percent is set at 10%, it doesn't mean that I now have to sell 10,000 electric vehicles. It means that I have to sell some amount of electric vehicles up to 10,000 credits, And the reason for that distinction is because an electric vehicle could be more than just one credit, or it could even be less than one credit. So every time I make a clean vehicle technology, I generate some number of credits. Yeah, and then depending on the type of vehicle, you get different amounts of credits, and we'll see what that means in just a second. This is probably old. Yeah, so forget the actual numbers, but you have small, intermediate, and large volume manufacturers. And the regulation applies to automakers slightly differently depending on how many vehicles that they sell in California. These were the old numbers before the sort of more recent ACC2 updates, which we'll cover. So in the previous generation of rules, the credits look something like this. So 4.5% in 2018, 7%, 9.5%, and so on and so forth. So our last year was 14.5% in credits. Does anyone know what percentage of vehicles in California were ZEVs last year? Sold or wait, what does that mean? Oh, cumulative or new? Yeah, new vehicles sold. Does anyone know? In California, not in the US.
We're throwing numbers out.
20%. Yeah. So 1 in 5 cars were electric last year. Yay. So we're actually beating this by a lot. Huh?
Yeah. Ukraine, Russia. Gas prices.
Oh, yeah.
But it's great news.
Sure. Yeah.
Why or maybe you're just before our used says in like the
In this? Oh, in incentives. So incentives is different.
Picking it's 2 cars. I have a lot of money. I have 5 cars. This is our true stories. I have 5 cars, and then I just buy another.
Like you personally have 5. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So okay, we're talking about slightly different things here. So when we think about the transition to electric vehicles, there are 2 fundamental issues, right? So there's a supply side issue and there's a demand side issue. So on the demand side, it's about how much people want to buy electric vehicles, right? And so there is this issue that EVs are more expensive than the average car, and so you might have incentives to help bridge that gap. There's also an issue about differences between people who buy new cars versus buy used cars, and so you may have a different set of mechanisms to help incentivize not just new car buyers, but also used car buyers. But all of these are demand side issues, right? Working on the consumer side. You can think of the ZEV regulation as primarily working on the supply side. So everyone in California could want to buy an EV, but if there are no EVs on the lots when you go to a dealer, then no one can buy an EV. So we really think of this piece of regulation as getting automakers to produce the vehicles, and then we also have separate sets of policies to try and get people to buy electric vehicles. Yeah, so this doesn't really help anyone buy an EV in any other sense than making it available, right? Yeah.
So if I understood correctly, an electric vehicle can generate more than 1 ZEV credit.
Yes.
So shouldn't that be either set at 1 or below 1 if you need to accelerate the number of new electric vehicles sold, especially as that threshold starts to level off. Yes, we're beating that right now, but if it starts to level off, isn't it a good idea to say that one electric vehicle or maybe one credit, 1.2 or 1.5 to encourage more of that new electric vehicles sold, manufactured in the state?
So, um, I'm not sure I would entirely agree with that. The size of the credit, if you look at this, the primary thing that's happening here is that the credits are incentivizing a size of battery or a size of range in your electric vehicle. So hypothetically speaking, right, if I gave one credit to any electric vehicle that was being sold, the thought is that GM could produce 1 million golf carts and claim all those credits.
Bare minimum ranges that would issue one credit.
So what would that standard be? Maybe at the bare minimum, you would get one credit, right? That's essentially what you're talking about.
Up that bare minimum, how about set that bare minimum at like 200 miles, 100 miles, and set that at 1?
Well, then you don't get
but
affordable reviews.
Right?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is just reflected in this as a concept. It's just you may have a different sense of like what number it should be at, right? But what you're talking about really is this, right? You're talking about setting thresholds at a certain range.
I'm just incentivizing that small and number of new EVs sold. So if let's say the ZEV is set at 10% or 10,000 credits, and we sort of continue 200 miles and we get to 5, and then we stick to manufacture 2,000 of those. You meet your compliance. So if you only
who's going to buy them?
Yeah, but
there's no demands.
Yeah,
but also that. But what's the problem with that? Like, I may have a target in mind, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is I want 10,000 2-mile or 200-mile vehicles on average. That just means I set this number at some number and I set my credits in some way such that my expectation is that that's how it would get fulfilled, right? And that's how these numbers get generated.
So how is the threshold determined as to how many credits we allotted, like 300 miles a year, 200 miles? How is that credit number generated? And does this change with time?
Yeah. So the idea is basically the smaller the battery, the easier it is and cheaper it is to produce. But we give awards for slightly larger vehicles so that some automakers can be incentivized to produce longer range vehicles. What was that?
I was saying some more than what we thought.
Yeah, exactly. And so you kind of have this diversity of things. And so this gives some ability of automakers to get flexibility in their strategy too, right? So some automakers like Tesla might be doing, 7, 8, 9 credits per vehicle. Although Tesla doesn't, well, we'll talk about Tesla in a second. They don't really need to worry about any of this in the direct sense. But let's say you're like GM versus Toyota, right? So GM's making these like 200-mile Bolts versus, Nissan is doing these 75-mile Nissan Leafs, right? So different strategies and kind of seeing what's better.
If Tesla sells those 7, 8, 9 credits to someone else.
Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah. Yeah. So, problems with this. What do you guys think? So, let's say my strategy is to reduce 100-mile electric vehicle. As an automaker, do I have any incentive to produce a 110 mile, 125 mile, 150 mile? No, right? Like this is flat. So the amount of credits I get for making the battery slightly bigger is nothing. Yeah.
These mile counts subject to like cycle ratings?
Yeah. So UDDS. No. These are standardized drive cycles. Yeah. And in fact, this is what we saw happen. Nissan, the first gen Nissan Leaf right here, right? Second gen Volt right here. The Model S just above the cutoff, right? And so that is a product of the stepwise function of the credits. So the next generation, which was the previous generation of credits, transformed to this. So you now have this linear scale that would incentivize, and they're actually a lot less at the top portion, right? 300, you're getting 4 credits instead of like 10. Okay. We'll cover a couple more slides and then we'll talk about some of the ZEV modeling next time. Yes. Transitional zero emission vehicles. So this is mainly referring to plug-in hybrids. So plug-in hybrids can't really get above this. So this is actually, you can be on the lower slope here and you would get less credits depending on certain aspects of your technology. Like if the engine was turning on at certain times, they had this penalty essentially. It's not just California that these policies apply to. So there's something known as the Section 177 states. Has anyone heard of Section 177? Yeah, so this is in reference to the Clean Air Act in the late 1970s, when the United States passed the Clean Air Act. Actually, California was ahead of the curve. They actually had their own Clean Air Act in place already, which basically enforced a bunch of clean air standards. And so because California's clean air standards were stricter than the national standards, when the when the Clean Air Act was passed by Congress in Section 177 of that legislation, they said, okay, all other states, you get to decide whether you want to comply with the US national standards or to comply with California's. And so these states here all decided to opt into following California's rules instead of the US rules. Again, because the California rules are stricter. And so these states are all basically required to follow any of the regulations that are passed in accordance with the Clean Air Act in California, which actually covers the ZEV rules. And when ZEV initially came out, these states were given the option to opt into that portion of California's Clean Air Act. Not all of them did, but those states would also be subject to following the ZEV rules in terms of like those percentages. So there used to be this thing called travel provisions, which basically says, okay, not all other states are ready for these electric vehicles, so we're going to let EVs being sold in California count as EVs being sold in other states, and there's like some kind of like proportional math that they do to like scale the credits. But those expired in 2018, and since then, other states have had to follow those rules. So these are now the states that follow ZEV, and what you'll notice here compared to that last list, that these are not just the 177 states. Legislatures within the states themselves have passed rules basically saying, we're going to follow ZEV. And so some of these are 177 states, and then some of these are just states that have essentially volunteered to follow those rules. Yeah.
Doesn't it also, there's so many in the states, then kick in California's 2035?
Yeah, kind of. So a lot of these happened before the ACC2 update, but yeah, now a lot of them will
By default,
yeah, well, actually, I'm not sure. It depends on how they structured it. They might just be following the old ones, which go out to 2025, and then they would have a choice to update. Actually, that's a good question. I'll look into that. I don't actually know if all states are automatically pulled into the new set of rules.
I don't know. Virginia had its also now Virginia's under the like 100% EV sales.
Yeah.
Overnight. So they could like do.
Yes. Yeah. So if they followed Californians, then all of these states would not be allowed to sell gas cars by 2035. So new gas cars. Credits can be banked, and they can also be traded and sold. You can look at that market on CARB's website. They actually give, they tell you who is selling them and how many credits are being sold, and they tell you who's buying them and how many credits are being sold. You don't know who is selling to whom, but it's actually really obvious because if you just look at the numbers, it's, yeah, you can match them up like fairly easily because there's like, this company selling 10,000 credits, this company selling 50,000 credits, this company received 10,000 credits, this company received 50,000 credits. And it's like, well, all right, I can probably figure that one out. Yeah. How much is a credit worth? So this is an interesting piece of it. So health and safety. So actually this is this is part of the health and safety code, right? This is regulated by CARB, so it falls under this piece of code. So they can charge $5,000 penalty per vehicle not produced. So the ZEV credit is the lowest amount of credit that can be earned by a pure ZEV. So therefore, it's essentially $5,000 penalty for each ZEV credit. Yeah, and so what is the most that a company would be willing to buy a credit for? $5,000, right? Otherwise, you would just take the penalty. So yes, Tesla could be making $5,000 in theory per credit if they're selling a single Model S that received 10 credits back in the day. Then one Model S could be worth $50,000 in credits, right? So there was a student here who actually had a project looking specifically at this. So prior to 2016, I believe, Tesla in their quarterly earnings statements would have a line item that said, this is the revenue generated from credits. You could then go and calculate based off of the trading amounts, right? That Tesla was selling credits, the value of one actual credit on the market. They stopped doing that as a separate line item, I think in 2017. So you can no longer directly track that. But suffice to say that Tesla would probably not be in business if it weren't for these credits.
So it sounds like that penalty is binding. Why is it set so low?
That's not low.
Well, right, but if the credits are in practice being worth $5,000, that means that companies are
it wasn't 5,000. It was like anywhere in the earliest days of ZEV, it was anywhere between like $3,500 to like $4,000 is I think what the market that student was who did that analysis was finding.
But if it's binding,
yeah, but it wasn't. Yeah. So it was worth a lot. And so, you know, Now the value of the credit is a lot lower because we're in excess. We have an excess of credits being generated because we're over complying with the targets, and that's going to change again, right? Once with the new rules, which we'll talk about next time. So we'll end here for today, and we'll pick up on some modeling.
To a 2.1 billion in revenue.